The dust swirled across the barren street of Promise Creek as 13-year-old Ruby Adams clutched her ragged shawl tighter around her thin shoulders. The year was 1868, and the mining town that had once bustled with the promise of silver and gold now sagged with broken dreams and desperate souls. Ruby's own dream had died 6 days ago when the influenza that had swept through town finally took her mother, the last family she had in this world. "Stand up straight, girl," Mrs. Winters hissed, yanking Ruby's arm as they stood on the auction block. "Nobody wants to buy a slouching child." Ruby bit her lip to keep from crying. She wasn't livestock to be sold, but Mrs. Winters, the town's self-appointed caretaker of orphans, had made it clear that Ruby would be given to whoever offered enough to cover her mother's burial costs. $3.42 stood between Ruby and whatever fate awaited her. "What about this one?" Mrs. Winters called out to the small crowd gathered in front of the general store. 13 years old, healthy enough, can cook, clean, and sew a decent stitch. Starting bid is $3.50. The townspeople shuffled uncomfortably. Some looked away, others murmured disapprovingly, but none stepped forward. Ruby felt her cheeks burn with shame as she stood on display. $2, called a raspy voice from the back. Ruby's heart sank as she saw Mr. Thatcher step forward, the owner of the saloon who was known for working his servants until they collapsed. His eyes were cold as he assessed her like a piece of furniture. $2.25, countered another voice, Mrs. Peterson, whose 6 children were known to torment their household help. $3, Mr. Thatcher countered, his lips curling into what passed for a smile. $3 for a healthy girl. "She's worth more as a laundress alone," Mrs. Winters protested, but the crowd had begun to disperse, uninterested in the fate of yet another orphan in a town full of tragedy. The sound of horse hooves interrupted the transaction. A tall figure on horseback approached, the sun at his back casting his face in shadow. As he drew closer, Ruby could see he was a stranger, a man in his early 30s with a weathered face that spoke of years under the harsh western sun. His clothes were dusty from the trail, but of good quality. The silver star pinned to his vest gleamed in the sunlight. "What's going on here?" he asked, his deep voice carrying across the now quiet street. "Just finding a home for an orphan, Marshal," Mrs. Winters explained, her tone suddenly honeyed. "Her mother passed, and there's burial costs to cover." The man dismounted, and Ruby could see his eyes clearly, now blue as a summer sky and filled with an intensity that made her want to look away. But there was something else there too, something that looked like understanding. "And how much would that be?" he asked, approaching the auction block. $3.42 for the burial," Mrs. Winters said, "but I'm asking $3.50 for the girl." The stranger reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. He untied it and poured several gold coins into his palm. "I'll give you $20 in gold," he said, his voice steady. "For the girl." A murmur rippled through the remaining onlookers. $20 was more than a month's wages for most people in town. Mrs. Winters's eyes widened. $20. "Well, the extra is for proper clothes and whatever else she needs," he interrupted. "I'll take her now." Ruby felt her breath catch in her throat. What did this stranger want with her? Was this fate better or worse than the others? He seemed to sense her fear and took a step closer, his voice softening as he addressed her directly for the first time. "My name is Clayton Dawson. I have a ranch about 2 days' ride from here. I need someone to help around the house, and you'll have your own room and 3 meals a day." He paused, then added, "You won't be mistreated. You have my word." Something in his steady gaze made Ruby believe him, though she'd learned long ago that promises were easily made and easily broken. Mrs. Winters snatched the gold coins before anyone could change their mind. "She's all yours, Marshal." Marshal Dawson nodded and turned to Ruby. "Do you have any belongings you need to collect?" Ruby shook her head. "Just a small bundle at Mrs. Winters's house." "Let's go get it then," he said, offering his hand to help her down from the block. Ruby hesitated before taking it, surprised by the gentleness of his calloused fingers as they closed around hers. As she stepped down, she caught Mr. Thatcher's disappointed scowl and felt a wave of relief wash over her. They walked in silence to Mrs. Winters's crowded house, where Ruby quickly gathered her meager possessions: a faded dress that had been her mother's, a hairbrush with missing bristles, and a small cloth doll she'd had since infancy. When they returned to the street, Marshal Dawson lifted her effortlessly onto his horse before mounting behind her. "Have you ever ridden before?" he asked. "No, sir," Ruby answered, trying to sit properly despite her nervousness. "Just hold onto the saddle horn and you'll be fine," he said. "We'll stop in the next town to get you some proper clothes and supplies." As they rode out of Promise Creek, Ruby didn't look back. There was nothing left for her there but painful memories. Instead, she focused on the rhythm of the horse beneath her and wondered what life awaited her at Marshal Dawson's ranch. The next town was a half-day's ride, and by the time they arrived, Ruby's legs ached from the unaccustomed posture. Marshal Dawson helped her down and led her to the town's general store. "Mrs. Henley," he greeted the plump woman behind the counter. "I need some clothes for this young lady, growing girl's size." Mrs. Henley smiled warmly at Ruby. "Of course, Marshal. Come with me, dear." Ruby followed her to a section of ready-made dresses and was astonished when the marshal instructed her to choose 3. She'd never had more than 2 dresses at once in her entire life. She selected the plainest ones, afraid to appear greedy. "And she'll need proper boots, undergarments, a coat, nightclothes, and a hat," the marshal added, seemingly oblivious to Ruby's wide-eyed shock. By the time they left the store, Ruby had more new possessions than she'd ever owned, all packed neatly in a small trunk that was strapped to the marshal's horse. They spent the night at the town's small hotel, with Ruby in her own room for the first time in her life. She lay awake for hours, running her fingers over the clean, soft cotton of her new nightgown and wondering why Marshal Dawson had chosen her and what he truly expected in return. The next morning brought another surprise. At breakfast, Marshal Dawson slid a small Bible across the table to her. "I noticed you didn't have one," he said simply. "Every child should have their own." Ruby picked it up carefully, opening to the first page where he had written her name in a strong, clear hand. "Thank you," she whispered, not knowing what else to say. They rode for most of the day, stopping occasionally to rest and eat the provisions Mrs. Henley had packed for them. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Marshal Dawson pointed to a distant smudge against the landscape. "That's home," he said. As they drew closer, Ruby could make out a modest but well-maintained ranch house with a barn and corral. Several horses grazed in a nearby pasture, and smoke curled from the chimney, suggesting someone was already there. A woman in her 50s emerged from the house as they approached, wiping her hands on her apron. Her gray, streaked hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her face, though lined with age, wore a kind expression. "You're back earlier than expected, Clayton," she called, then noticed Ruby. "And who might this be?" "Mrs. Abernathy, this is Ruby Adams," the marshal said as he dismounted and helped Ruby down. "Ruby, this is Mrs. Abernathy. She helps around the house 3 days a week." "Pleased to meet you, Miss Ruby," Mrs. Abernathy said, offering a warm smile. "Ruby will be staying with us from now on," Marshal Dawson continued, a hint of something like uncertainty in his voice. She'll be helping with household duties. Mrs. Abernathy's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded. Well then, let's get you settled. You must be tired from your journey. Ruby followed Mrs. Abernathy into the house, surprised by its neatness and simple comfort. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, with sturdy furniture arranged practically around it. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with more books than Ruby had ever seen outside of a schoolhouse. This will be your room, Mrs. Abernathy said, opening a door off the main living area. Ruby stepped inside, amazed at the space that was to be hers alone. A proper bed with a colorful quilt, a small dresser, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and even a rocking chair by the window. It was more luxury than she had ever known. I'll let you get settled, Mrs. Abernathy said. Supper will be ready soon. Left alone, Ruby carefully unpacked her new clothes, arranging them in the dresser drawers with reverent care. She placed her mother's dress and her doll on the bed, the only connections to her past life. That evening, over a simple but delicious meal of beef stew and freshly baked bread, Marshal Dawson explained his expectations. I'm away often, riding circuit as marshal, he said. Mrs. Abernathy comes Monday, Wednesday, and Friday to cook and clean, but I need someone here full-time to tend the chickens, gather eggs, keep the garden, and help with other chores. Ruby nodded, understanding now why he had chosen her. He needed a servant, and she was cheaper than hiring a full-time housekeeper. You'll continue your schooling, he added, surprising her. There's a school 3 miles from here. You can ride one of the gentler horses once you've learned how. School, Ruby echoed, unable to hide her confusion. She hadn't attended regularly since her father died 3 years ago. Yes, school, Marshal Dawson confirmed. Education is important. In the evenings, you can practice your reading with the books here. Ruby stared at him, trying to understand. Servants weren't sent to school. Servants didn't have their own rooms with rocking chairs. Servants weren't given new clothes and Bibles with their names written inside. Why? She finally asked, the question that had been burning inside her since he'd placed those gold coins in Mrs. Winters's eager hands. Marshal Dawson set down his fork and met her gaze directly. 5 years ago, I found a young boy in a situation similar to yours. He'd been orphaned and was being auctioned off to work in the mines. I took him in, raised him as my own. His voice softened. Typhoid took him last winter. His name was Samuel. Ruby saw the pain flash across his face before he carefully composed his features again. I couldn't save him, Marshal Dawson continued, but when I saw you on that auction block, I thought perhaps I could give you the chance he had, however brief it was. So I'm to replace your son? Ruby asked, her voice small. No, he said firmly. No one could replace Samuel, but you deserve a chance at a decent life just as he did. That's all I'm offering. Ruby considered his words carefully. What should I call you? She asked finally. Clayton is my name, he said, but most call me Marshal Dawson. Yes, sir, Ruby replied, defaulting to the formality that felt safest. He smiled slightly. That will do for now. The days that followed established a routine. Ruby learned her chores, quickly feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, helping Mrs. Abernathy with the laundry and cooking when she was there. Clayton taught her to ride on a gentle mare named Daisy, and true to his word, she began attending the small schoolhouse 3 miles away. The other children regarded her with curiosity at first. Is the marshal your pa now? They asked. No, Ruby would answer. I just work for him. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. Servants didn't eat at the same table as their employers. They didn't receive new books or have employers who checked their schoolwork each evening. One afternoon, about 2 months after her arrival, Ruby returned from school to find Clayton repairing a fence near the house. She hesitated, then approached him with the spelling test she'd aced that day. "Sir, I thought you might want to see this," she said, holding out the paper. Clayton wiped his hands on his trousers and took the test, his face breaking into a broad smile as he saw the perfect score. "Well done, Ruby. You've been studying hard." His praise warmed her more than she expected. "Thank you for the books," she said. "They've helped a lot," he nodded, looking at her thoughtfully. "You're a bright girl. Your mother would be proud." The mention of her mother brought unexpected tears to Ruby's eyes. She blinked rapidly, trying to hide them. Clayton noticed, and his expression softened. "It's all right to miss her," he said gently. "I still miss my parents, and they've been gone 20 years now." "Does it ever stop hurting?" Ruby asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not entirely," he admitted, "but it changes. Becomes something you can carry without it weighing you down so much." Ruby nodded, appreciating his honesty. "Come on," he said, setting down his tools. "I think we've both earned some of Mrs. Abernathy's apple pie. She left one cooling this morning." As they walked to the house together, Ruby felt something shift inside her, a tiny loosening of the knot of grief and fear she'd carried since her mother's death. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider that perhaps this strange new life might become something more than just survival. The seasons changed, and with them, Ruby's place on the ranch evolved. She was no longer simply doing chores. She was helping to run the household. Clayton taught her to manage the accounts, to calculate expenses and income from the small herd of cattle he kept. "You have a good head for numbers," he told her after she'd correctly balanced the ledger one evening. "Better than mine, truth be told." Ruby glowed with the praise, no longer shy about accepting it. Over the months, she'd grown 3 inches taller and filled out from the regular, nutritious meals. Her once dull hair now shone with health, and her eyes had lost their haunted look. On her 14th birthday, Clayton surprised her with a gift, a beautiful leather saddle of her own. "You've outgrown the child's saddle," he explained as she ran her hands over the tooled leather in awe. "And Daisy is officially yours now, too." Ruby looked up at him, overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," he replied with a small smile. "Just keep up with your studies and your chores." That night, as Ruby lay in bed, she realized something profound had changed. She no longer thought of returning to her old life or wondering when this one would end. This was home now, and Clayton, while not replacing her parents, had become someone she trusted implicitly. The next few years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. Ruby excelled at school, often bringing home books from the teacher's private collection to satisfy her voracious appetite for knowledge. She helped with the ranch, learning not just household management, but also how to mend fences, care for livestock, and even basic veterinary skills when a horse or cow fell ill. Clayton remained the town marshal, sometimes gone for days at a time on his circuit, but always returning with small gifts, a ribbon for her hair, a new book, once even a small silver locket that had belonged to his mother. "I want you to have this," he'd said, fastening it around her neck. "My mother would have liked you." Ruby touched it reverently. "What was she like?" "Strong," Clayton answered immediately. "Determined. She crossed half the country in a wagon to make a new life after my father died. Never complained even when times were hard." He smiled slightly. "You remind me of her sometimes." The comparison filled Ruby with a quiet pride. She'd come to understand Clayton better over the years. His reserved nature masked a deep capacity for kindness. He rarely spoke of his past, but occasionally shared stories of his time as a young man working cattle drives, or his early days as a lawman. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ruby found the courage to ask about something that had long puzzled her. "Why did you become a marshal?" she asked. You seem to prefer the quiet of the ranch." Clayton was silent for so long that Ruby thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice distant as if reaching back through memories. "I had a younger sister," he said. "Emily. She was 16 when a group of outlaws raided our town. The marshal then was a drunk who hid while people were robbed and killed." His jaw tightened. "Emily was one of them." Ruby's hand instinctively reached for his. "I'm so sorry," he nodded, acknowledging her sympathy. "I decided then that I'd never stand by while people who couldn't protect themselves suffered. Took the badge 5 months later." Ruby understood then why he'd stopped at that auction block in Promise Creek, why he'd paid gold for a girl who was being sold for pennies. It wasn't just about Samuel, the boy he'd lost. It was about Emily too, and all the people he hadn't been able to save. "You're a good man, Clayton Dawson," she said softly. He squeezed her hand briefly before releasing it. "I try to be." On Ruby's 16th birthday, Clayton gave her another precious gift, her mother's wedding ring, which he'd tracked down through Mrs. Winters back in Promise Creek. "How did you find this?" Ruby gasped, tears filling her eyes as she recognized the simple gold band her mother had never removed, even in their poorest days. "Mrs. Winters took it before the burial," Clayton explained, his disgust evident. "She'd sold it to a traveling peddler. Took some doing to track it down." Ruby slipped it onto her finger where it was still too large. "I'll keep it on a chain until I grow into it," she decided. "Thank you. This means more than I can say." That same year, Ruby faced her first real test of courage since coming to the ranch. Clayton was ambushed while pursuing a gang of cattle rustlers. He managed to make it home, but with a bullet in his shoulder and fever setting in fast. The doctor was away delivering a baby in a distant homestead, and Mrs. Abernathy was visiting her daughter 2 towns over. Ruby was alone when Clayton stumbled from his horse, pale and bleeding. "Ruby," he gasped as she ran to him. "Got to get inside." She helped him into the house and onto his bed, her heart pounding with fear as she saw the blood soaking his shirt. "What do I do?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Bullets got to come out," he said through gritted teeth. "My kit, in the drawer." Ruby retrieved the small medical kit he kept for emergencies, her hands shaking as she opened it. "You can do this," Clayton told her, his eyes glazed with pain but focused on her face. "I'll talk you through it." Taking a deep breath, Ruby followed his instructions, cleaning the wound, sterilizing the instruments in whiskey, and finally, with trembling fingers, extracting the bullet that had lodged in his shoulder. Clayton passed out during the procedure, which was a mercy. Ruby stitched the wound as neatly as she could, then bathed his face with cool water to combat the fever. For 2 days, she barely left his side, changing bandages, spooning broth between his lips when he was conscious, and praying harder than she ever had in her life. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. Clayton opened his eyes, clear and lucid for the first time since his return. "Ruby," he said, his voice weak but steady, "you saved my life." She burst into tears then, all the fear and tension of the past days releasing at once. "I was so scared," she admitted. "I thought you were going to die." Clayton reached for her hand with his good arm. "But I didn't. Thanks to you." As he recovered, something shifted in their relationship. Clayton began to rely on Ruby not just for household help but for partnership in running the ranch. He consulted her on decisions, valued her opinions, and spoke of the future as something they would face together. On her 18th birthday, Clayton presented her with legal papers. "What are these?" she asked, scanning the formal language. "Adoption papers," he said quietly. "If you want them." Ruby looked up, stunned. "You want to adopt me? But I'm already 18. Makes no difference to the law," he said. "Or to me. You've been my daughter in my heart for years now. These just make it official." He hesitated, suddenly uncertain. Unless you'd rather not. Ruby threw her arms around him, the papers clutched in her hand. Of course I want that, she said, her voice choked with emotion. I've thought of you as my father for so long now. It was the first time she'd admitted it aloud, and the first time she'd seen Clayton Dawson, the stoic Marshal, wipe away a tear. That spring, Ruby graduated at the top of her class from the local school. The small ceremony was attended by Clayton, Mrs. Abernathy, and a few neighbors who had come to know and respect the bright, capable young woman Ruby had become. "What now?" Clayton asked her as they rode home afterward. "You could go to that women's college back east. I've saved enough." Ruby considered it briefly but shook her head. "This is where I belong," she said confidently. "I want to stay and help you with the ranch. Maybe teach at the school when Miss Parker retires next year." Clayton nodded, a smile touching his lips. "I was hoping you'd say that." Life settled into a new pattern. Ruby took on more responsibility at the ranch, and when Miss Parker did indeed retire, Ruby stepped in as the new teacher 3 days a week. She thrived in the role, bringing the same determination and intelligence to teaching that she brought to everything else. It was at a town social that autumn that Ruby first noticed Caleb Rogers, the new doctor who had taken over the practice when old Dr. Simmons retired. He was perhaps 5 years older than her, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that put even the most nervous patients at ease. "Miss Adams," he greeted her, tipping his hat as she served punch at the refreshment table. "Or should I say Miss Dawson now? I heard about the adoption." "Either is fine, Dr. Rogers," she replied with a smile, "though I'm proud to be a Dawson." "As you should be," he said. "Your father is well respected around these parts." He accepted the cup of punch she offered. "I understand you're teaching at the school now." 3 days a week, she confirmed. "The rest of the time I help run our ranch." "A woman of many talents," he observed, his admiration evident. "Would you care to dance? Unless you're needed here." Ruby glanced at Mrs. Peterson, who had also been serving refreshments. "Go on, dear," the older woman encouraged. "I can manage." The dance was a simple waltz, but Ruby found herself unusually aware of Dr. Rogers's hand at her waist, the clean scent of his shaving soap, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. "You dance very well," he commented. "Mrs. Abernathy taught me," Ruby admitted. "She said every young lady should know how to dance properly." "She taught you well," he said, guiding her smoothly around the floor. From across the room, Clayton watched the pair, his expression unreadable to most. But Ruby knew him well enough to recognize the mixture of pride and melancholy in his eyes. Later that evening, as they rode home together, he mentioned it casually. "Dr. Rogers seems like a fine young man." Ruby felt her cheeks warm. "He's very nice." "Dedicated to his patients, too," Clayton added. "Mrs. Abernathy says he rode 15 miles in the rain last week to tend to the Hanson baby." "I didn't know that," Ruby said, impressed despite herself. Clayton nodded, saying nothing more, but Ruby could tell he approved. "Over the next few months, Dr. Rogers Caleb," as he asked her to call him, became a regular visitor at the Dawson Ranch. Sometimes he brought medical journals he thought might interest Ruby, who had developed a keen interest in medicine after treating Clayton's gunshot wound. Other times, he simply came for dinner and conversation. Clayton welcomed him warmly, often finding reasons to retire early to his study, leaving the young couple to talk by the fire. "Your father isn't very subtle," Caleb observed one evening with a laugh. Ruby smiled. "He means well." "He loves you very much," Caleb said, his tone serious now. "It's clear in everything he does." "I know," Ruby replied softly. "I'm very lucky." Caleb reached for her hand, his touch sending a flutter through her chest. "I've come to care for you deeply, Ruby," he said. "I hope you know that." She met his gaze, seeing the sincerity there. "I care for you too." Their courtship progressed through the winter and into spring. Caleb was patient and respectful, always mindful of Ruby's reputation and Clayton's position as both father and marshal. He asked permission before escorting Ruby to socials or taking her on buggy rides through the countryside. One sunny afternoon in April, Caleb asked Ruby to accompany him on a picnic by the creek that ran through Dawson land. The wildflowers were in bloom, carpeting the meadow with splashes of color. "It's beautiful here," Caleb said as they spread a blanket beneath a cottonwood tree. "Peaceful," Ruby nodded, breathing in the fresh air. "This was always my favorite spot on the ranch. Clayton used to bring me here when I first arrived. I was so sad and frightened then." She smiled at the memory. "He'd tell me stories about the land, the animals, anything to distract me from my grief." "He's a good man," Caleb said, unpacking the basket Mrs. Abernathy had prepared for them. "I admire him greatly." "So do I," Ruby said simply. They ate their meal, talking easily about Caleb's patients, Ruby's students, the latest news from town. As they finished the apple pie that was Mrs. Abernathy's specialty, Caleb grew uncharacteristically quiet. "Is something wrong?" Ruby asked, noticing his sudden nervousness. "Nothing's wrong," he assured her quickly. "In fact, everything feels more right than it ever has." He took a deep breath, then reached into his pocket and produced a small velvet box. "Ruby Dawson, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" He opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring with a small pearl set in the center. It was simple but beautiful, much like the love that had grown between them, steady, honest, and true. Ruby felt tears spring to her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, Caleb." His face broke into a radiant smile as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "I spoke with your father yesterday," he admitted, "asked for his blessing." "And," Ruby prompted, though she already knew the answer. "He said he couldn't imagine entrusting you to anyone else," Caleb replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Said he's been praying for a man worthy of you, and he believes I might be that man if I spend my life trying to deserve you." Ruby laughed through her tears. "That sounds like Clayton." Caleb leaned forward and kissed her gently, his lips warm against hers. It wasn't their first kiss, but it held a new promise of a future together, of a family they would build, of love that would endure. When they returned to the ranch, Clayton was waiting on the porch, his expression telling Ruby he already knew what had transpired. "Congratulations," he said, embracing her tightly. "I couldn't be happier for you both." "Thank you, Father," Ruby said, the word still new on her tongue but feeling absolutely right. The wedding was set for September, giving them time to prepare. The entire town seemed to take an interest in the union of their respected doctor and the marshal's adopted daughter. Women offered to help with the dress, the flowers, the food. Men volunteered to build additional seating for the ceremony, which would be held on Dawson land near the creek where Caleb had proposed. Throughout the preparations, Ruby found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here, from a frightened orphan being sold for pennies to a confident young woman, preparing to marry a man she loved deeply. None of it would have been possible without Clayton's intervention that day in Promise Creek. The night before the wedding, Ruby found Clayton sitting alone on the porch, staring out at the stars. "May I join you?" she asked softly. He nodded, making room for her on the bench. "Nervous about tomorrow?" he asked. "A little," she admitted. "But mostly excited." Clayton smiled. "Caleb is a good man. He'll make you happy." "I know," Ruby agreed, "but I wanted to thank you for everything, for saving me that day, for giving me a home and education." She swallowed against the lump forming in her throat. "For being my father when I had no one." Clayton's eyes glistened in the moonlight. You saved me too, Ruby. After Samuel died, I thought I'd never feel like a father again. You gave me that gift." Ruby leaned her head against his shoulder as she had so many times over the years. "I'm not going far," she reminded him. "Caleb's house is only 2 miles away." "I know," Clayton said, "and you'll always have a home here too." The wedding day dawned clear and bright, as if nature itself approved of the union. Ruby dressed in the simple but elegant white gown that Mrs. Abernathy and several other women from town had helped her make. Her mother's ring hung on a gold chain around her neck, nestled beside the locket Clayton had given her years ago. A knock came at her bedroom door. "Ruby, are you ready?" Clayton's voice called. "Come in," she answered, turning from the mirror. Clayton entered, handsome in his best suit with his marshal's badge polished to a high shine. He stopped when he saw her, his expression one of wonder. "You look beautiful," he said softly. "Just like your mother must have looked on her wedding day." Ruby smiled through tears. "I wish she could be here." "She is, in a way," Clayton said, touching the locket at her throat. "And she would be so proud of the woman you've become." He offered his arm, and together they walked out to the meadow where nearly the entire town had gathered. Caleb waited beneath an arch of wildflowers, his face lighting up as he caught sight of Ruby. As Clayton placed her hand in Caleb's, fulfilling the final duty of a father, he whispered something only they could hear. "The best investment I ever made was $20 for a daughter beyond price." Ruby and Caleb exchanged their vows beneath the wide Montana sky, promising to love and cherish each other for all their days. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the assembled guests carried across the valley. The celebration continued well into the evening with dancing and feasting under lantern light. When it was time for the newlyweds to depart for their new home, Ruby sought out Clayton one last time. "We'll see you for Sunday dinner," she promised, embracing him tightly. "I'll hold you to that," he replied with a smile that didn't quite hide the emotion in his eyes. Caleb shook Clayton's hand warmly. "Thank you for trusting me with your daughter, sir. I promise to cherish her always." "See that you do," Clayton said, his tone light but his meaning serious. "She deserves nothing less." As Ruby and Caleb rode away in the buggy decorated with ribbons and flowers by the town's children, Ruby looked back at the man standing alone watching them go, the lawman who had paid gold for an orphan girl and called her his child. 5 years later, on a crisp autumn morning much like the day Clayton had first brought her to the ranch, Ruby sat on the porch of her and Caleb's expanded home, watching her 3-year-old daughter Emily chase butterflies in the garden. Inside, Caleb was tending to their newborn son, a sturdy baby they had named Clayton in honor of his grandfather. The sound of hoofbeats announced a visitor, and Ruby smiled as she recognized the familiar figure approaching on horseback. "Grandpa's here." She called to Emily, who immediately abandoned her pursuit of butterflies and ran toward the gate, her dark curls bouncing with each step. Clayton dismounted, his movements a bit slower now but still strong for a man in his early 40s. Time had added a few more lines to his face and threads of silver to his hair, but his eyes were as bright and clear as ever, especially when they landed on his granddaughter. "There's my girl," he exclaimed, swooping Emily up into his arms. "Have you been taking care of your mama and baby brother?" "Yes," Emily declared proudly. "I helped Papa change the baby's wrappings," Clayton laughed, carrying her toward the house. "Is that so? You're becoming quite the little doctor." Ruby rose to greet him, accepting his one-armed embrace as he still held Emily with the other. "Perfect timing," she said. "Caleb just finished the baby's examination." Inside, Caleb stood cradling their son, a tender expression on his face that never failed to warm Ruby's heart. The years of marriage had only deepened their love, their partnership strengthened by the joys and challenges they'd faced together. "How's my namesake today?" Clayton asked, setting Emily down to accept the baby Caleb offered him. "Strong as a bull and twice as stubborn," Caleb replied with a laugh, "just like his grandfather." Clayton looked down at the infant in his arms, his weathered face softening. "Hello there, little man," he murmured. "You've got your mother's eyes, thank goodness." Ruby watched them together, the man who had saved her life holding the son named in his honor, and felt her heart might burst with gratitude for the family she had been blessed with. Later, as they shared the meal Ruby had prepared, Clayton shared news from town and the surrounding areas. Though he had scaled back his duties as marshal in recent years, training a younger man to eventually take his place, he remained respected and involved in the community. "Johnson's oldest boy is getting married next month," he reported. "And the new schoolhouse should be finished before winter sets in." "Good timing," Caleb commented. "With the railroad coming through next year, we're likely to see more families moving to the area." Ruby nodded, thinking of how much the territory had changed since she'd first arrived as a frightened 13-year-old. Towns were growing, civilization pushing ever westward. The wild frontier was slowly being tamed, though not without resistance and occasional violence. After dinner, while Caleb put Emily down for her nap and the baby slept in his cradle, Ruby and Clayton sat on the porch just as they had so many evenings at the ranch. "I've been thinking," Clayton said after a comfortable silence. "It might be time to sell the ranch." Ruby looked at him in surprise. "Sell it, but you love that land." "I do," he acknowledged, "but it's too much for one man to manage and you have your family here." "What would you do?" Ruby asked, concerned. Clayton smiled. "I was thinking I might build a smaller place right there." He pointed to a section of Caleb and Ruby's property that overlooked the creek. "If you and Caleb wouldn't mind an old lawman for a neighbor." Ruby's face lit up. "We'd love that. The children would be able to see you every day." "That's what I was hoping," Clayton admitted. Watching Emily grow, and now little Clayton too, it's brought me more joy than I ever expected to have in this life. Ruby reached for his hand. "You gave me a second chance at life," she said softly. "I'm so glad you're here to share in the family Caleb and I have made." Clayton squeezed her hand, his eyes bright with emotion. "That day in Promise Creek," he said, his voice reflective, "I thought I was saving you, never realized you'd end up saving me right back." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ruby thought about the long, unlikely journey that had brought them all together. From an orphan girl sold for pennies to a woman blessed with a loving husband, beautiful children, and the father who had chosen her when the world had turned its back. Clayton eventually built his small house on their land, a comfortable cabin where Emily and little Clayton spent many happy hours listening to their grandfather's stories and learning the values that had shaped their mother: courage, compassion, and the understanding that family was about more than blood. In time, more children came to bless Ruby and Caleb's union, another daughter they named Sarah after Caleb's mother, and a third son who arrived unexpectedly when Ruby was nearly 40, whom they called Samuel in memory of the boy Clayton had lost so many years before. The community continued to grow around them. Caleb's medical practice flourished, with Ruby often assisting him and developing a reputation for her skilled nursing and gentle way with patients. Clayton eventually retired his marshal's badge completely, but remained a respected figure whose counsel was sought on matters of importance to the town. On Clayton's 60th birthday, the entire community gathered to celebrate the man who had served them for so long. As Ruby watched her father accept their tributes with characteristic humility, she reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had bound their lives together. A desperate orphan, a lonely lawman, a chance encounter on an auction block in a dying mining town. $20 that purchased not a servant but a daughter. A legacy of love that now extended to grandchildren, who would carry forward the values and memories of those who had come before. In the end, Ruby knew it wasn't the gold that had mattered. It was the recognition of another soul in need, the willingness to reach out across the divide of circumstance, and the courage to build a family not from obligation, but from choice. That night, as stars filled the vast Montana sky, Ruby stood between the two men who had defined her life: Clayton, her father in every way that mattered, and Caleb, the husband who had helped her build a future beyond anything she could have imagined that day in Promise Creek. "I am so blessed," she whispered, her heart full to overflowing with gratitude for the journey that had brought them all together. And in that moment, surrounded by the family created through love rather than blood, Ruby Adams Dawson Rogers knew she had found the truest home of all, not in a place, but in the hearts of those who had chosen her, just as she had chosen them.